So I'm going to call to order the SHAPE Committee meeting of February 14th, and I guess we move on to roll call.
Chair Smithers?
Yes, here.
Vice Chair Chateau? Here. Committee Member Barr?
Present.
Caldwell?
Yes.
Dell?
Here.
Feeney?
Here.
Knight?
Here.
Neiman?
Here.
Park? Salvestrin? Here. Smith?
Here. Okay, so now that we got number 2 done, if there's anybody out in the public that wants to address the SHAPE Committee for one of the non-agenda item, I don't know if there's anybody that wants to speak to the greater good on something. Oh.
Just a brief update. Allison Mattioli, who was your point of contact, has accepted a job in a different city. And so we are transitioning the staff representative for the committee, and from this point forward, it will be our city clerk, Cindy Jafopoulos.
Okay. So on to consent items. Our one consent item is the approval of the SHAPE Committee meeting minutes from February 7th. Do I have a motion or any?
I move to approve the meeting, the minutes from February 7th.
I second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Okay, now on to new business. 5.1, Mark's going to make a presentation to us.
Good evening. So tonight's an exciting night because you've been on a journey for the last couple of months, and tonight we're really passing the torch to the committee. You're going to take an opportunity this evening to decide how to approach decision-making over the course of the next couple of months. I recognize you still have a couple of informational needs. You're waiting for the city to provide information on any restrictions that might apply to buildings. You will receive an update on the long-range financial forecast, and we know that the Cosmont team will be assisting you over time. We anticipate bringing you all the final items by the 28th, the meeting of the 28th. So next week, as you remember, is our community workshops, those 2 workshops, and then we'll be back on the 28th with this committee. So tonight, what we want to start with is to take a moment, probably about 15 minutes, to talk a little bit about the visioning exercise that you participated in about 2 weeks ago. And Jean Holsten is going to facilitate that conversation and also transition into 5.2, where we will talk specifically about decision-making and a framework. And in fact, we may get deeply involved in starting that this evening. So you'll notice we have a couple of boards here, and Cindy and I are prepared to scribe. And then we'll take an opportunity to refresh you on the focus group activities that are planned and talk to you a little bit more about that. So with that, let me pause and I'll turn it over to Jean.
First of all, I just want to note that it is Valentine's and you are all here, so thank you very much. This is a little above and beyond the normal call of duty, which is why we gave you some kisses. Those are the only kind you get during this meeting. You have to wait for the rest of it at home, but thank you. So you should have a document. We gave you a pile of documents. You should have one that says the Property Visions exercise. We had handed those out at the last meeting as well. Just very briefly, like Mark said, about 15 minutes to say, was there anything you noticed as you read that? You all participated in different groups. We did a little bit of talking about the exercise after it. But this is the opportunity to say, I'm noticing this or that. Maybe you're noticing that there's a lot of similarities, or there's a lot of differences, or maybe there's something that's not on there that you think should be added or captured. So we welcome any comments.
It seemed to me that as I read through this, there's a lot of duplication in these ideas. but what makes it difficult to kind of interpret it is that it lacks context, because when you're discussing it amongst four people, then you understand why somebody is making this suggestion. But just to put down a number, rehabilitate, 6 people thought they should, what does that mean? And so it's all out of context. And so until we have that context, it seems like,
After that exercise, I went home and started thinking about kind of a matrix that was missing of how each one of these venues relate or don't really relate to each other. And then I started thinking about, is there a priority where, does the police department relate to Lyman Park? Does the police department relate to the library? Does the future community center relate to the library? Would the library relate to the park? And, you know, I created kind of my own matrix at home and started realizing it's really hard to see these entities separately, because we really need to see how they relate to each other as far as a priority. So if we move something around or change the venue or something, we got to really always say, now, is it serving synergistically to the other entity next door? Should they be close together? Because I always felt like the police department really had no relationship with Lyman Park. And I never saw City Hall having a relationship to Lyman Park except for the outhouses. So and maybe this kind of gets back to what Doug's talking about, this kind of sense of context with each other. So when you read these things, it's hard to understand all the thinking that went behind each one of these suggestions.
just to elaborate on that theme, it seems to me that part of our specific duty is to look at toilets and broken things and dry rot and how are we going to finance the repairs of these things. But it seems to me that in addition to that, what we need to have, because we own all of these buildings, $25 million worth of buildings, as a community, that we have to know in a broader sense how each one of these buildings helps each person in this community and will into the future, because what we do here is the beginning, one would hope, of a bigger, broader plan, an idea of how this town ought to look eventually here, based upon the work we're starting here. And that then throws us into the sphere of what's happening with Adam Street, because that, as you were saying last week, Mark, that's a big piece of all of this, because then you can look at these individual pieces. You can be much more creative if we're going towards a specific goal, an overall picture of what this town ought to be, as opposed to let's just fix the dry rot in that individual building. And as you're saying, not tie them together as a whole, as holistic. These are all the things that need to serve the citizens of St. Helena, and how do we do that in the best way, as opposed to how do we fix the Signorelli barn. As individual one-offs, it doesn't make much sense.
You know, I think we got onto that topic one night, and it was brought up by my friend Stan here. We were talking about visioning, and I think we were told that wasn't really our purview to do that. So I appreciate that you're saying that, because I think it's important too, but it's my understanding that that's not within the parameters of what we're supposed to be discussing.
I think I'd push back a little bit on that, in the sense that I think what you just described is the importance that we understand what people in this town value, what their needs are, which is what I've been referring to as decision criteria. And I think by creating the decision criteria, we're essentially creating a type of vision. We're trying to understand what people want. And when we start to piece all of these things together and create alternative, combined strategies, to me, those are all sort of separate visions of what we want the city to look like. So we're going to create like multiple visions and work them through our system and try to use this process, I think, to essentially define what the vision is. It's different from going out to the public and saying, here's a blank piece of paper, tell me what the vision is for the city. That's just too hard. It's a vague question. You hand people a blank piece of paper, you'll get a whole mishmash of different descriptions of what the city should look like, and I don't think we would be able to assimilate it into anything useful. I think it's our task to create multiple working visions that we're going to run past the public and get their feedback and say, what do you think, which one of these is the best vision for this city? So I think we'll actually get there, just maybe in a little different way than what you were describing.
And that is the next thing we're going to be discussing here, is exactly where you're naturally going. But if we could just focus in on what you noticed either in that exercise or what's on here. And one of the things I'm hearing that you noticed is that you talked about these properties individually, but a lot of them, there's trade-offs in there, and some of them go together for some of you, some of them, and so that is one of the limitations of taking it one property at a time. So I want to make sure that it's
what
captured.
I got out of it was, as has been already spoken to, is it is a rather complex situation. But I think what else I got out of it, whether we each, or maybe there's some over here and some over there, at the end of the day, we really all want to improve the situation, and we want to be able to provide the community what the community wants, and so we're all sort of part of that. But I don't think we're on these polar opposites of, what should happen to City Hall, or what should happen to, the police station, or what should happen to some of even the more minor buildings like Head Start. I mean, that is the one thing that comes out of this with all these alternative uses and these ideas, is everybody does want to improve the situation. So I think that's the best place where we can all be right now, is nobody's sitting around saying, well, this is a ridiculous exercise, what's the point? Or somebody saying, well, nothing can be done, if we have to borrow any money to do it. So that's not where it is. I think there are a lot of great ideas in here. It is pretty diverse right now. There are a few properties specifically where, it's kind of interesting. You look through here and, there's a lot of alternative uses and there's a lot of ideas, but then you get to a property like Signorelli Barn. Okay, there's not really much there, and even Lyman Park. So I think that goes back to Oliver's comments about priority. We do have to make sure we focus on the bigger issues and the priority issues, and I think that's sort of what's migrating even out of this exercise.
I was just going to, excuse me, Mark, I was just going to add that I think due to the complexity and the decisioning that we're looking at, the comments thus far lend to that a need for some kind of a framework or a decisioning criteria or some kind of vision structure that will help reduce some of the complexity or streamline some of those decisions. So I think that that's just kind of the general context of how do these buildings tie together, or are there some decision criteria, visioning criteria, if you will, that will help in setting some of the priorities and making some of those individual property decisions that in isolation seem a little bit complex and unrelated. So what I'm hearing, I think, ties together some of the need for some kind of synergy or some kind of decisioning structure that'll help reduce the complexity of these individual lists. Thanks.
I just have a quick comment. I think just in looking, and if anybody sees anything in my teeth, will you tell me, because there's this camera here and I don't want that to be documented. Thank you. So I think just we look at the list of buildings, I think there are a few that were purpose-built and are in pretty good shape and maybe need some money added to them to make them better for the long term. We've got the fire department, the library, and that seem to be that, right? They are what they are. We want to keep them what they are and just make them a little bit better in terms of improvement. Scout Hall and Carnegie buildings seem to have some restrictions against them which preclude them from being used for things that are other than what they are. Like Scout Hall needs to be Scouts, Carnegie needs to be for the city, whether that can be different parts of the city that could use them, that remains to be seen. But really, when we get down to the brass tacks of where the big problem is, it's City Hall and its inadequacy and its deferred maintenance issues, and what do we do with that? Because I think that's kind of the first question we need to answer in terms of, once we have that, then we can look at what's left. And our other choices that go with that are the Teen Center, the former CDF building, and Signorelli Barn doesn't really work for that. Head Start doesn't really work for that. And the corporate yard either needs to remain the corporate yard or become something different. But it won't be part of the integral core of the city offices. So absent Adams Street, we're really looking at City Hall, the Teen Center, the former CDF building, as being our alternatives to where we can house City Hall. And I think it kind of starts with that. And that's my 2 cents.
That was one of my takeaways, too, just to interject there. I think that's a really good point when you're looking at kind of groups of priority buildings.
I've been thinking it would be great to have a big chart on the wall, and maybe we start with City Hall, because I agree with you, Jeff, that is the priority. And when we move something, we may have to move something else, and move the pieces around to see how they fit, and see also what's the relationship of one building to the other. Do they need to be close together? And I've been thinking about doing that myself at home, because I think it's going to make us think more clearly if we can see the ramifications of moving one building into a spot and moving another one. Because I can see it a little more complicated than you do. But certainly I think we need to start with City Hall.
I have to agree with both Jeff and Pat also. I think City Hall is our main priority to start with. I mean, and seeing them on paper somewhere and envisioning them is a great benefit.
I'd like to maybe step back just a touch. I remember when I left that meeting, I wasn't thinking in terms of some of the details that you're talking about, but I'd like to compliment all of you in that I never felt that people were locked into a particular outcome or advocating on a particular thing. There was a great deal of openness about the ideas that others were sharing, and I just want to compliment you. I thought it was a very interesting and helpful exercise for me, at least, feeling that I was working with people that really had quite an open mind in how to proceed.
When I was looking over it, I thought I would really like to have more information on the people that use it, and we might get that through the community workshops, but a lot of times we would make comments like how many kids are really using this, how many classes are in this building, the teen center, how many kids are there, how often do they use it. All of that would be very important to me to be able to understand that more.
Well, and I think that's where we're getting at. You listen and you hear a lot about how to go through the decision-making process, and and Stan even used the words, decision-making criteria and framework. Well, that's the next item on our agenda, is to decide how we want to go forward with this whole process. So,
you ready for that piece? All right. So, in your pile of papers there's one that says decision-making process for SHAPE committee. So Mark and I talked this through and said, let's offer you two very broad approaches as a way to start this conversation. So one is what we're calling an unstructured approach, and the other one is a structured approach. I'll get into the details of that in a minute, but I think what we really want to do is highlight what you've just said, which is what you're being asked to do is rather complex and complicated. And if you just look at Mark Smithers' binder there, you've got quite a few pages of data, and you don't even have all of it yet.
I have two. This is just one of them.
See, exactly. This is huge. So I do think that determining what you're supposed to do with all of that information is absolutely crucial. So the first thing is going back to the resolution from the City Council that started this committee. And that's in that paragraph there. And I just want to go over that very briefly and read it. So the general purpose of the committee is to identify alternatives to address deficiencies and opportunities identified in the facility conditions and needs assessment, challenges identified in the long-range financial forecast, and feasibility of concepts identified in the 2009 visioning statement. For example, library expansion, civic building, amphitheater, community center, etc. Additionally, the committee will be identifying financial strategies, along with identifying consequences and trade-offs for City Council consideration to address identified deficiencies, opportunities, and/or utilization of community assets. So I lead groups all over the place. And I know that when 11 people are looking at a paragraph like this, they're all understanding slightly different things by what's written here. So the first thing is, let's talk about that. What I want to do is invite Mark to begin that conversation with teasing out some of the words here and what he is understanding they mean. But then I would like all of you to weigh in, because the scope of the work is your framework. That's the beginning place. So what is the council asking you to do? And that's the first place that I want us to talk about before we get into a decision-making framework. So would you be willing to start us off, Mark?
Sure. So just a couple of observations. I think just key words or words that jump out at me and what they mean. One of the first words that jumps out is the reference to alternatives. It's plural. That's intentional. I think there's an expectation that there may be more than one great idea here or mix of ideas. And so I would encourage you not to be constrained by, the effort to try to figure out the one single answer. I think there are a number of different ways to approach the challenge, and clearly the council has said they're looking for you to identify alternatives. Another key word, and one that's probably open to a lot of interpretation, is opportunities. So what does that mean? I think opportunities can mean look at a parcel and consider rezoning that. Could a rezone of a parcel enhance its value? Can that particular parcel potentially be a revenue-producing asset for the community? Is an opportunity perhaps to lease or sell a parcel to generate revenue and leverage that revenue in order to address deficiencies or enhance an asset or consider building a new asset. The reference to the 2009 visioning statement, I think my perspective here is that the council is seeking your feedback on this. This isn't something that they necessarily need an item-by-item analysis of, but there are ideas in that document, and the council is encouraging you to consider some of those concepts in the context of the challenge with these various amenities. So I don't think you're locked into necessarily a deep treatise on that document, but instead consider some of those ideas. But even if you don't agree with all of those ideas or any of those ideas, that's okay. You've taken a look at that and considered it. And then in terms of financial strategies, just know that Cosmont will help you. And in fact, at the prior meeting, I mentioned that they would be available, and we were holding March 7th. In the context of preparing for tonight, we've rethought that, and I think we anticipate you're going to need a little time before you settle on some options that might be refined enough for them to look at how you might identify financial strategies. So we've now programmed them for March 28th and are holding that date a little farther out. And of course, we can bring them back at a subsequent date as well. So those are just some preliminary thoughts, and I'll turn it back to Jean.
So as you look at this, what are some of the ways that you're understanding the scope?
Well, I'll start. I would just agree with a comment that Mark made that I don't think it is the purpose of this committee to come up to a single consensus recommendation to the City Council. I frankly think that would be really, really hard to do, to get 11 people who all have somewhat different value structures, and the value structures are going to show up in what you think is the ideal solution. To get all of us to come to an agreement on a single solution, frankly, I think is a hard task, and I don't think that's really the role. We're not the decision makers here. The City Council are the decision makers acting on behalf of the public, and I think it's our job to present them with some number of the best alternatives with really clear explanations of why these are the ones that rise to the top, and that will lead into a really good discussion with the City Council on what are we going to do here. But coming to a single consensus recommendation, I think, is an impossible task for us.
I would focus on another word in this paragraph, and it's the word deficiencies. Until we identify and somewhat agree on what the deficiencies are in the city, it's going to be difficult for me, especially, to make a decision about the assets.
Grace, are you? Sorry, Pat. Are you talking about deficiencies? I think you said deficiencies in the city. Are you talking about the city government? Because I think this is referring to the deficiencies in the assets themselves.
Well, maybe we don't. We're deficient. Maybe we're deficient in some assets that we could build.
Okay. All right. But it's all related to the needs assessment, right? And the EMG report. Okay.
Deficiencies might be, excuse me for interjecting, maybe the flip side of opportunities, the other side of that might be deficiencies. Take those two, maybe they go hand in hand in a way.
And I'm thinking of the feasibility of concept identified in the 2009 visioning statement is important for us to look at again, because there's a lot of things that we talked about there that we wanted to have done that perhaps aren't feasible now, but some may be. So I think we really need to make sure that we don't forget that visioning statement.
I was talking to one of the city council members. I won't name who he or she is, but they had kind of an interesting take on the Adam Street visioning, that there was a lot in there, and it's probably most useful for us not to think of it as a vision for Adam Street, but because it was so encompassing, it's sort of a vision for the city, and that we should look at using all of the facilities that are at our disposal to sort of serve the parts of that vision that we think still apply. So he or she expanded it to be more of a vision for what people in the city want, not necessarily on that one location, but in general.
I had a comment. We have a lot of information, 2 binders full, and sometimes when I'm working at my desk, I'll have more than one window open at a time, like my email one and maybe some kind of Google one or whatever, so I can see different pieces of information at once. And right now my head's spinning a little bit because there's pieces of this puzzle that we frankly don't have that are integral to finding out what those solutions and needs are. And then there's all the other pieces of the puzzle, like the long-term financial health of the city and what the projected revenues look like and what kind of money we're going to have to fix the deficiencies in the assets, what assets we need, what assets we don't need. But I think the piece that we're missing to help, and I would love to see 5 windows open on that wall where you could see all these pieces at once and click through it and understand, like, oh yeah, well the money's going to be here in 3 years, we pay that note off then we can fix this, then we can do that, we can sell that, we can lease that, we can rebuild that, and kind of get a cohesive thing going. But the one piece that, other than some of the buildings like I mentioned earlier that are purpose-built, I don't have a clear understanding myself of what is it we need. And I don't mean a community-driven criteria of what do we think St. Helena needs for the citizens. Certainly that's part of it. But I mean the more definable piece right now, which is what does City Hall need for their needs moving forward? Where would they prefer to be? How do we get them to somewhere where they can be with the most efficient use of our resources? But for me, I find it hard to kind of remember what the financial criteria are, how much did this building need for repairs, what did they need to do here, and but I think all that kind of needs to gel together with, what is it we really need?
I completely agree with the complexity of how you're describing it. Right now, I think the question on the table, though, is what's the scope of the committee? What's the work product that the city council's planning? That's the question right now that we're sort of discussing. That do we all understand, or do we coalesce around an idea as to what do we think the council's expectations are? And Tim was speaking to, alternatives, and I agree. I mean, we may actually coalesce around a lot more than we maybe right now think we will. I mean, I think there's variations of that. You may say we can coalesce around that something needs to happen with a certain facility. We may not coalesce around what that answer is to what we do with that, where it moves to or whatever. Or we may really have a lot of agreement on what happens with the facilities themselves, and the alternative and the variations may be, how do you finance it? Or over what period of time does the improvement of it takes place, because either we're doing it through internal cash flows, or we are borrowing money, or we're selling. I mean, so certain areas we may be very close together. So I think alternatives is a big deal. I don't think there's one magic number. I would like it to be as good as what we did in the utility rate study, where everybody was on point with all 15, with the exception of 2 outliers on one item. So that would be fantastic, but I'm sure that's not what's going to happen. This is definitely going to, Tim's right. I mean, we're going to be handing the city council something that sort of gets them a lot closer to where we are today. But it's really, really important, though, for us to deliver something to city council, because nobody's been dealing with this for the last 25 years, so we do have to get there.
It seems to me that some of the confusion comes from the fact that we have all the facilities are meant to serve the citizens of St. Helena. That's why we own them. If that's not the case, we should get rid of them. Some of them are easy to define. That is the fire station and the city hall. That's service oriented. We know what they are. We know what the yard is about. We need a place to put the trucks that fix the roads. We know all that. We have several other properties, though, that are meant to serve the citizens of St. Helena as well, but they're ill-defined in what they actually do for the city, and therein lies the confusion. What are we getting as a city out of the Head Start building overall? Is it enough? And if it's not enough, then what should we do with that building that makes it enough? And also, these buildings should be self-sustaining if it's possible to be self-sustaining. The service buildings, obviously, are self-sustaining in the service. But if it's the Carnegie building and we're not making revenue to pay for that elevator that needs to be repaired, then we should be making revenue, or we should be putting something in there that's going to either generate revenue or generate services for our community, more cultural events, more this or that. Then when you add those little pieces together, and we all talk about what these buildings can be, should be, then we can look at, it seems to me, at Adams Street and go for the bigger vision even of, well, okay, we can have town meetings and call it a civic center at the Carnegie building, but maybe we want a cultural center that's something beyond that. Maybe we want what was in the 2009 visioning, which was an amphitheater, or maybe it's a combination so that you can play music and have an open lawn between the music and another building, so that in one way you're looking at this and you turn around your blanket and now you're looking at this. So there are a lot of opportunities there for big vision once we solve the problems with the buildings we have that are underutilized and figure out how to make them pay for themselves.
So within the scope document, what you've just really been talking about is all the opportunities we do have, which is one of the things that the City Council wants us to do.
That's exactly right. And the other part of it is the deficiencies. We need to repair these buildings to get them up to a standard that we can actually use them, rent them, lease them, and that's the first challenge. That's the deficiencies. But they've been we've pretty well defined this now. We've had all of this information. I think there's quite a bit more to find as well. But some of it's speculative. What if we did this? Would somebody be interested in buying it? Not buying it, leasing it? It seems to me it's always crazy for any city to give up anything they already own and it's paid for. But leases make a lot of sense. So but we have to figure out how we're going to do that, and I think that's what our next goal is meant to be here. And how do we do it as a group or independently and come back as a group? I guess that's what we're talking about next, right?
Does anybody have any more comments on the scope and what they think are the expectations are of the city council?
I do. I'm trying to understand, there's 11 paintbrushes on one canvas, and I'm always trying to imagine everybody's applying something to this painting. And we got a little cubism, and then we got impressionism, and then it's kind of dancing around my mind exactly how do we go from all this kind of abstract, kind of conceptual ideas about all these assets to like really like coming down to a game plan. And it seems, is it possible that everybody could make a presentation of what they think the answer should be for every one of these buildings and how they're going to finance the whole thing? And
Oliver, but wait a sec. That's
no, I'm just talking about an exercise.
These are two approach. That's the next topic. Right now, we're trying to. I hate to interrupt you, but we're just trying to say, are we all clear on what City Council expects us to deliver to them?
Well, I think it's from my understanding, they want you to think in a big way and not be limited by any sacred cows or think.
Right.
Think in a big way that everything is possible as far as the alternatives and the opportunities. That's how I'm reading what Mark's saying. And not to be limited, like you're second guessing, like, oh, well, these people over here won't like that, or this has always been this way and it can never be, it's a sacred cow. Mm-hmm. So the directive I'm getting is to think really broad base, don't be afraid, and to really look at every asset as being plastic. It could be used in any different way. That's how I'm reading it.
Thanks.
So is there anything else on just the scope? I'm assuming that you're going to keep massaging this throughout this process and deciding exactly how you want to present things. And it could be very different kinds of alternatives. But this is sort of the framework. Okay? So you're doing a beautiful job of segueing into the next piece. So what we've offered you on this piece of paper are two approaches. They're meant to really give you at least something to talk about concretely. You can change any of them, you can delete them, but the two that we're offering to you in very broad stroke is an unstructured approach, which we're defining as pretty much what Oliver was starting to say, that each committee member prepares their own presentation of alternatives for the facilities, presents it to the rest of the committee. The committee would ask questions, there would be information gathered. We've got a little bit of a timeline on it, so maybe each committee meeting would have 3 or 4 presentations with questions and answers. Questions that couldn't be answered would be captured so that there might be more data that comes in. And then there would be meetings that happen after the presentations that answer the questions, give you the information, and then walk you through a process to deliberate. So that's an unstructured, and we call it unstructured simply because you really each get to decide how you would do the presentations and the way you would approach them. So that's one. The next one is a more structured approach that we're describing, which is also what you've been talking about. Determining what some of the criteria are. How do you want to make these decisions? It could be something that's put into some form of a matrix. What are some of the values? What are the opportunities that you see? What are the things you want in the city? We've got actually an exercise that we might take you through to begin that process. So you look at the big picture and try and get some of the discrete components out so you know what you're measuring against. It's almost like creating the windows that Jeff was talking about so that you know what you're comparing and how you're assessing these things. This is not, now it's not meant to be a structured project or approach is not meant to limit or cut things out from the very beginning. It's just giving you a framework, and it's really talking that through one step at a time. So you, like I said on this page, you would look at each one of the components, you'd look at the criteria, then the next step is that once you have the criteria, and it would take a few meetings to do criteria, then you would analyze each facility utilizing the criteria, and it doesn't mean you analyze them individually. You might bunch them together. That's actually determined in that second step. And then more questions are generated. You might need more data. You'll get that. and then you make your final recommendations. We put guesstimates on timelines for these. They can be actually fairly parallel, depending on how the presentations go. So now that's open for discussion. What do you think about those approaches?
My very first opinion for myself only is the structured approach. I just think that doing an individual unstructured approach, each one comes up. I like working together, and I just think we could get further working on it in a structured approach than we can doing it individually. Coming up, everybody has their own idea of what to do. I just feel I personally would like the structured approach myself.
Yeah, I want to jump in here. I couldn't agree more with that. I think we have to go with a structured approach. I think on a couple levels, the unstructured approach would be pretty time-consuming for each individual. And I think what it also does is it sort of, I think, builds in a place where people are, they sort of dig their heels in. They've come up with their whole, grand plan, and then they have a hard time listening to other opportunities versus, if we got a structured approach and we're talking about criteria, and I do believe, like Suzanne said, there's going to be more discussion along the way, and I think we will find a better place for us to all hopefully land together versus, having, sacred cows that people don't want to give up and that sort of thing. So I'm 100% behind the structured approach.
Is it possible we could do a hybrid where we had 3 groups of 3 or 4 people each, and we got together in that group, just kind of like we did when we did our breakout sessions, and then that group made their presentation with the same kind of timing parameters, so this doesn't go on until August of 2019, and we can get
There's a calendar.
Okay, is it not?
It's not going to go to August. There's a calendar on the second page.
But I mean, I think that would it be possible? I don't know what the Brown Act says about 3 or 4 people from this group getting together. Is that possible to do? Is anybody interested in doing something like that? I just think the broad brush stroke or the different strokes that Oliver talked about kind of gets so many brushes on the canvas, you're not really sure what you're looking at the end, and we may have a tough time coming up with any kind of consensus, which is okay because we're 11 different people. But if we had 3 groups or 4 groups, or we could do kind of bounce ideas off of one another, remind one another of different things. Oh, what if we did this? What if we did that? I think that would elicit a lot of great ideas, and then we could have those 3 different groups come up and say, hey, we thought of this, we thought of that, and I think from that we could distill that down to become our presentation. That's my thought.
I like the structured approach, and I think it speaks to something that Tim spoke to earlier, and that is the values of the people who live here. I think it's important, and I'm going to trust Gene Holsten to do this, that if we do it as a structured approach, that as people present their ideas, that they're written down somewhere on a board or whatever, one of those sheets, so that no one feels that their idea was left out. But I think it addresses a lot of the things that we've talked about. It even kind of talks about vision in a sense. It doesn't use that word, but it does talk about that. And although I think I'm going to do the unstructured approach by myself at home, because it's just something I want to do, I think that it could turn into a real can of worms. And I'm not sure that we would get anywhere very fast. So I agree with you, Suzanne.
I think Pat's idea is a good one. Do your homework so that when you show up here, you'll have some framework for how you think this could work, so that we're not just saying, well, let's talk about the Signorelli and we'll have 15 ideas again as we had the other night. Let's all try to think in terms of how we see it holistically for the town, and if we did this and did this, and then try to hear what everybody else is saying. Oh, that may be a better idea. So we'll go that way as opposed to the other. But at least we'll have some things in mind, and then it becomes the structured approach, but with an unstructured capability brought in from our own homework or our own thoughts.
The one thing I was just thinking about with the structured approach, the structured approach, because you're building a framework, it's going to give you reasoning behind everything that, you decision you make and what you propose versus just saying, well, that's what I like.
Right, exactly right.
I like the structured approach too, and I would love if we had some of the questions ahead of time to be able to think about it, not just in that general presentation, but sort of specific what we're going to be discussing at the meeting.
I
Well,
like
it
Pat's.
won't-
Oh, I'm
go ahead.
sorry. I just wanted to say I like Pat's idea, and I'm going to follow her way and do my unstructured approach at home on my own.
You know, one of the things we're going to need is maybe some better numbers. I know that when EMG did their presentation, there were a couple, three of you who questioned some of those numbers, and I questioned the cost per square foot they used for construction. And if we're going to do this, we're going to have to do it with numbers, or it's not going to make much sense. So I'm wondering if we're going to get some updated numbers.
That's one of the criteria, right? You just stated a criteria right there. We have to have good numbers.
Just a brief comment on numbers. One of the items I was working on today with the finance director was long-range financial forecast, so we have to make certain assumptions, and we're still building that document. And updated EMG numbers are going to be a part of that. And so that's something that we're working on, and we've imposed a deadline so that we make sure we deliver EMG updated numbers to you and a long-range financial forecast, at least a draft that will be an educated guess on a few different methodologies that we'll be testing. So we'll have that information for you at your next meeting, because we'll take next week off. That will be available at your next meeting on the 28th. And I know we have at least one public comment on the discussion now.
Okay. Are you saying the long-range financial forecast is going to be available at the next meeting?
We will have a draft for review.
Okay.
I was going to say, excuse me, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm Robin Orsini. I just had another idea, kind of, it's structured and unstructured, and I'm hearing that a lot. It makes me a little nervous that you all have to decide your criteria without really looking at the buildings and talking about the criteria for those buildings. Now, some of you have identified buildings that are easier than others, and I too wish we had a map. But my suggestion is you do a hybrid of maybe starting by looking at some of what you consider to be easier buildings. Start easy and develop your criteria as you're looking at the buildings. So you can say, well, that really is an important criterion to have a place for kids to go after school. We have this facility. Let's move it. We keep the criterion, but you don't know that criterion really, in my mind, until you've looked at what facilities offer that already. So kind of a dual hybrid. Then you go back and say, oh, well, this is how we've developed it. Let's settle on our final criteria. How does it fit what we've got so far?
I was just going to add that I think that one of the nice things that we're developing here in the data gathering is a lot of content. The visioning exercise, we're going to have the town focus groups that are going to bring in a lot of really good content and information in. The financial information, the building assessments by EMG, and then we've got some financial support from the Cosmont Group. I think that using the structured methodology will be a good approach to give us kind of a framework to develop criteria that are critical to the city operations, and then we could fold in some other visions or nice-to-haves, if you will, that are coming out of the focus groups and some of the visioning. One of the other pieces that I thought would be good for content is to find out if there's a needs assessment on the part of each city department. If we could get that piece to add to the puzzle, it might be nice to know what each department sees as components they need or that they're missing or that they priorities for them, add that to the mix.
Mark, are we getting an updated space assessment, I thought?
From a space standpoint, we did make educated guesses about space needs for the staff, so that was incorporated a bit into the EMG report. I think it wasn't broken down in a way that necessarily translated that very well, but I think just instinctively knowing about the size of the staff, the growth of the city, that we can feel comfortable with the space numbers that they provided. So something in the 11 to 13,000 square foot range, not much different than today, but you have the space organized in a different way so that it works better for the organization. And then I think there is a question about whether you separate the police activity, which could be separate from City Hall or joined with City Hall. So there's some square footage there that could be taken out or left in.
And the need that space thing that EMG did, it also provided for like the Park and Rec Department and for corporate yard or public works and that sort of thing.
Right.
Okay.
I don't want to be the contrarian here, but
You will be.
I wish it was not down to these two alternatives of structured and unstructured. I think that they overlap in my mind already, because everybody's got a little bit of an idea about each one of these buildings and how to pay for things. And what's missing about the structured is in the unstructured, we get to hear the full stream of consciousness of how you go from A to Z and all the arguments in getting there. I know there's a little bit of worry about people's toes being stepped on or being humiliated, or maybe they have a plan that everybody's got their thumbs down on. But there's a lot of intelligent people in this room, and I like to kind of hear from different people what they think and have them just flow through the process. So because there might be something in there that makes a lot of sense to me, or maybe it doesn't make sense to me, but I'm not afraid of the dialectic. So I'm a big fan of the British parliamentary system, where people kind of throw things at each other and yell at each other, and sometimes we're a little bit antiseptic here, And
Good catch, Mark.
So I hope we don't really put the straitjacket on us, because it's just going to seem very abstract to me, going from meeting to meeting without really hearing the nitty-gritty about what do you really think about the City Hall. Do you want to keep it there? Do you want to move it, or what? And what's the reason behind it? I guess I want to hear in depth people's thinking, because I know it's like a big puzzle that they're putting together, and then I can see the actual relationship in their mind of how this all works, because in the end you got to pay for it. And then that's the last piece of the puzzle that goes in there, because so often we can like pat each other on the back in the structured one, going, yeah, let's do that, and then everybody forgets how we're going to pay for it, because that was the failure of the 2009 Adams Street vision plan, because everybody got really involved in painting this beautiful picture of this utopia, and then at the end of the day, somebody said, well, can somebody write a check? And they forgot that part. So I'm saying, I'm not advocating one or the other, I'm just saying, I don't know if I see it so delineated, so like tightly like that. So
If I know this group, I think we're going to hear what everybody thinks about every building.
I think so.
I think the structured approach will just help us sort of get our hands around each property and facility, and also flush out the ideas that everybody has. We're going to hear from it. I mean, we go off script so much on this committee. We'll definitely hear from everybody. Yeah. In fact, we hope to have everybody go off script and tell us what they think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think the structured approach is that boxed in. I mean, basically what we're talking about here is not a set of prescribed steps that we have to march through to do it. The structure is actually quite simple. It's simply breaking the problem into its fundamental components. And there are kind of two, there are three, but there are two main ones that we've got to get some clarity around before we start to have this discussion about what we really want to do. And it's the criteria and a good diverse set of alternatives. The third piece that decision analysts always talk about is how much information do we have enough, and what do we need to go get. So that the structure that we're talking about actually has a lot of flexibility within each of those components, and I think we'll have a much clearer and cleaner conversation when we get to the point where people are talking about, well, how do we put all this together and what do you really think we ought to do? But it gives us a framework from which to have that discussion much more cleanly. And there's a whole science behind how to approach complicated problems like this. There's a whole profession out there of people that do this sort of thing. They test different approaches on these kinds of problems, and they would pretty much universally say when you have this much complexity, you've got to break it down into components, because the fundamental problem we've got is there's so much going on here. If you ask any one of us to try to roll that around in your head and make sense of it, you will make mistakes. You know, we all have decision processes that are informal for small decisions, and they work just fine, but those processes don't scale with complexity. In fact, if you try to scale them with complexity, you will introduce a whole host of really well-known biases and processing problems that human beings suffer from when they try to deal with too much. And that's the benefit of breaking it into a structure, is you need to break it into bite-sized pieces. We as a group need to come to some clarity on what the key criteria are that we need to capture. We need to come up with a set of alternatives that we need to consider. And if we can get some clarity around that, then we can start putting it back together and dealing with some of the complexities. But if we dive into the complexities right up front, we're going to have some problems. One of the other big benefits of having a nice, clean structure is we've got this huge challenge of communicating this out to the public. We have to be able to communicate the basis for what we're bringing forward in a transparent and logical way to the public. And the public has to be able to understand that, and they have to trust that the methodology that we're using is capable of identifying the very best alternatives that are out there. That's a huge challenge, and if we just all tell a story to each other and we all talk about all the wonderful things about my story, I frankly wouldn't believe that you had exhausted all the possible stories out there and that this one somehow rises to the top. If you don't have some structure to explain how does that compare to everything else that we could possibly do as a city, I'm not going to believe it. So, I mean, I'm clearly a big proponent of structure. I do this for a living. I would never approach a problem like this in a storytelling sort of way. It just doesn't work.
I just wanted to add something. I agree with both of you. I wonder if it would be, this just throw out an idea, to Oliver's metaphor of the canvas and individual visions that might have different paintbrushes. We're charged with being a sounding board. We are channeling a lot of information from the city, from Public Works and the buildings, what we've seen internally, some of the public forums that are going to be coming up, finance. There's a lot of information that's flowing through the committee, and I just wonder if, as a prelude to, say, the structured approach, if it might be worth, this is just an idea, investing a little bit of time, to Oliver's point, but also approaching the need for structure. Would it be valuable or take too much time to enable each of us to individually throw out kind of a very short synthesis of what we've heard and how that might play out in a facilities plan, knowing that we would move through? It might tease out some of the criteria, some of the decision criteria and priorities that we need to have. It would be like a prelude step, if you will, to going into a structured approach. Might bring out some of the content, some of the priorities, and some decision criteria.
Didn't we kind of get that in the visioning exercise and the summary?
That's an important piece of it. Yeah,
but I think that's kind of. I mean, I'm listening to what you're describing. As far as hearing what everybody thinks and what their vision is. I think that's why we did the visioning exercise at the time that we did, to sort of flush that out.
That's a good point.
Now, maybe if you're suggesting we need to do more of that, I guess that's something we'd all have
that's a good point.
Figure out.
Well, I think there's a way to do what you're describing, but what it points you at is identifying the criteria. And instead of presenting sort of a very specific plan that we should do this with this facility and that one with that one, rather sort of step back and say, kind of imagine what the ideal solution looks like. And I don't mean looks like in terms of where you do things in different facilities, but what does it look like in terms of what it delivers to the people of this town? It's not a description of what to do with City Hall. It's a description of what services or what attributes do I want at the end of this that describes a success to me. And so you wouldn't describe it in terms of something like, well, we need a new City Hall. Nobody cares if we have a new City Hall. What you care about is, do we have a high-quality City Hall that delivers the services that we all want? So if you can describe it maybe in terms of the things that it delivers to us, then I kind of agree with your approach. But I think we're going to get kind of anchored on things if we all describe, well, I think we should do A, B, C, and D with these different facilities. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, to that point, I'm just re-looking at the first sentence in the structured approach, number 1 there. It talks about isolating some of the components and criteria. So that first step is a cycle to go through, and that would be teased out from the data that I was talking about that we're all kind of synthesizing in our heads. So maybe that first step in developing criteria and components is just a natural next step. So maybe I'm answering my own question.
I think it's important, and I hate this expression, but I'm going to use it, that at the end of the day, we give the City Council something with enough structure, not just vision and amorphous ideas, but we need to give them something with enough structure that they don't have to start doing this all over again.
But what if we did something where each person wrote down 3 of their most, the alternatives that they would like to see come forward out of all this? And we could just submit those to Mark, and Mark could start the meeting by reading anonymously, here's the 33 ideas of A, B, C, D, and E. Go ahead.
So let me...
I didn't quite understand what you were...
Well,
alternatives to, like, everybody's going to give us 3 alternatives to what they're going to do for City Hall, or 3 alternatives to what they're going to do for the 11 facilities?
Take your pick. Three things that are important to you to come out of this. And then, for example, on the unstructured...
Isn't that going to come out when we get in the middle of this exercise? I mean,
potentially.
People are going to come out with their opinions.
But I think but Oliver's point, I think, is well taken, that to hear what some people here have to say would be, I think, insightful, and I think some people may not say what they want to say because the quorum, the structure doesn't allow for everybody to always get their thought out when they're thinking about it. And I think that if there are 3 things that are important to each person, they could say, hey, here are my 3 things. I want to see, the Scout Hall redone, I want to see Head Start thing, and I want to see the Teen Center updated, or whatever those 3 things might be, and then we could have that as part of the basis of our overall conversation. And it would allow people to get ideas out that they feel that are important to them that might not be addressed otherwise.
I guess if everybody does their homework, when we get started on this process, when we start getting to facilities discussed with criteria, and hopefully everybody will bring their ideas. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to everybody, and there are a lot of great ideas, and at the same time, I'm also listening to Tim, and knowing that he does this for a living. He didn't want to mention a person that does it for a living, but I think he finally did. I put a lot of weight. If you don't have some parameters and framework, it just goes off in one tangent and then bounces and goes to another, and then you hear something from somebody else, and that all of a sudden changes your mind. I don't know. I think it just bounces around. And again, I think when we deliver something to City Council, we have to be able to tell them what was the basis for the proposals that we're making.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I would hope that everybody would do their homework and bring their ideas once we get to that stage. I mean, we've heard ideas about what to do with certain facilities since we started this committee. So I don't think anybody's lacking for saying what they think.
So I think everybody will have a chance to do what you guys are describing. It's just, where do you put it in the order? Do you build the framework first and then start using that as a way to talk about what you think the better solutions are, or do we start out by just guessing at what the better solutions are and try to back out a framework from that. That just seems upside down. I don't know what the best thing is to do with all these properties. I would punt on your exercise because we don't have a framework to do the evaluation. How am I supposed to evaluate the best thing to do with a property when I don't have all the information yet? I haven't built a framework for how to do it. I'm just making a wild guess, and I think we need a framework before we start putting it together and talking about combinations and solutions.
And I think we should try the structured approach and see how it goes. And if we need more, we can add more to it.
And I don't see them as either ors. I think somebody talked about a hybrid or a mixture, because what I'm listening to, and part of what you're bringing up, Oliver, is that making sure that people have the opportunity to present their ideas and that you can, and to tease them out. This is why I'm advocating for this property in this way. To me, the structured approach gets a lot of that thinking out at the very beginning, so that you all know the values, the things that are the priorities, that are not just per building, but that are your broader priorities for the city, for the perspective that you have, that those get out on the table. Then the second phase is when you start playing with alternatives. So what are you going to do with them? How does this mean? And that's where the different perspectives comes in. They don't get truncated, but you at least have a framework so that folks that are... So here's the thing. We all have personality structures that approach decision-making in different ways. Some of us are concrete sequentials. We want information, we want a plan, we want it to go step by step, we want all of these things to open up and these spreadsheets, and we just think they are fabulous. And some of us are storytellers and abstract randoms, and we just want to go around, and we need a process that takes all of that into account. The deal is, if you start with identifying some of your values, some of what's important to you, does that negate the more abstract? I don't think it does. I think it invites it in, and you can describe your values in whatever way you want and begin to describe your criteria. And it doesn't limit you. It just gives you a sense of where everybody's at. You still get to do your alternatives in that second phase.
Could I ask a question that relates to sort of how we get some of this information? Are you going to is the feedback sessions with the community on the 21st and the 22nd going to have some portion of it dedicated to the criteria that the community values? In addition to, I just worry that perhaps they get into the storytelling mode and we don't get out of it what I think we need. So I just ask that.
So what my idea was to take you through this process of beginning to identify criteria by very broad questions. For example, starting with, what is really valuable to you in the city of St. Helena? What is really important? And to begin that process, that's the same process I would take the focus groups through and the public, both. So you start big with what's important to you. What are some unmet needs? As you look at these assets and as you determine a way forward, as you give advice to the city council, what are some unintended negative consequences you want to avoid? So it's really looking at that broad stuff first, and we capture that. And then we have another meeting on the criteria that begins to get into specifics. So traffic is an issue. Having public places, whatever. And we get really specific about those, not to lock you in, but to really get a sense of what are the important components of this whole process to all of you.
Just to confirm that you're saying you would take the same track with the community as you just described you would be working with us on.
Yes.
Thank you.
I just looked up criteria. Excuse me for using my phone, but I'm hearing various definitions of criteria go around. A principle or standard by which something may be judged or decided. So when I think of criteria, I think of having good financial information, like Mark mentioned earlier. I think of it as having good, I don't know that we have the best information we could about the utilization of the various facilities. Let me turn this off now. But that's what I think of as criteria. And then further down we talk about values. That's a different thing, and I hear us mixing the two. And actually we're supposed to start discussing criteria tonight. And I would love it if we could start establishing what the criteria are so that the people, Gene, you and Mark and people from the city could provide us with information if we don't have it.
So I'll offer a little feedback from a decision analysis standpoint on some of these terms, at least the way that community uses them. A lot of people don't really like the term decision criteria. I use it because I think it's easier for people to understand. That profession tends to use the word objective, but different people use the term objective in different ways in the English language, so it's sometimes confusing. But what an objective is it's fundamentally based on something that you value. So, let's take traffic, for example. People probably value less traffic over more traffic. So most objectives, the procedure is to start out by identifying something that you place a value on, identify a direction to it. In isolation, if I don't have to worry about anything else, any other impacts, no trade-offs, do you prefer more or less of that thing? So the objective would be stated, I prefer to minimize traffic. The decision criterion is the metric that you use to measure that, because just saying I prefer to minimize traffic, it's not really useful in a decision-making context, because how do I compare minimized traffic for two alternatives? I have to have a way to measure that. You either define, intersections of importance or traffic volumes on specific roadways or something. So the decision criterion is the metric that is used to measure the objective, which is based on your value structure. So that's kind of the way decision analysts tend to define those terms. In here, I've been using the term decision criteria more often, though I throw in objective every once in a while just because I'm trained to think that way and I can't help it. But
for those of us who aren't analysts, I'm just trying to make my point that I think of criteria as, and maybe it's somewhat what you're saying, information that we have to have in order to begin to make a decision. And then I hear it mixed up with values. That's my point.
Well, the criteria are linked back to something that you value, and you're right. We will need information to be able to forecast how any alternative will do on that value. So for traffic, we obviously will need information on traffic for any of these combinations. If they have an impact on traffic different from the status quo, we'll need to go out and collect information on that to be able to quantify that criterion as best we can. Because at the end of the day, if I've got two alternatives side by side and they differ on their traffic impacts, that's important to me. I need information to be able to quantify that so I can compare them, and I can use it when we have to make the very difficult trade-offs that we're eventually going to be faced with. So it's kind of a general procedure for doing this. I think that what they've got planned tonight is the right way, is to start a little bit general and let people put ideas out here about values and whatnot, because those lead to objectives and criteria. But we got to kind of dip our toe into this before we start crystallizing these into specific describable criterion that we can use in the evaluation.
Can I just ask, in the end, does this committee come up with one optimum plan that's presented to the council, or Coke versus Pepsi or something? Or I'm a little confused here. I mean, Is it one idea and then the council reacts to it?
It can be one or it can be several.
Okay.
I think if it's several, I would encourage you to try to limit it to no more than 5, probably preferably 3. So, 3 or 4 different options. And
If there's more than 2, Oliver's going to be in charge of writing them up.
And,
I want all your candy if you could make me do that.
3 or 4 configurations, because I obviously recognize there are multiple properties in play, but a manageable number of options with trade-offs and consequences, and perhaps different financial strategies on how you fund the desired outcomes.
But I would imagine, I think I've already said this once tonight, but I don't think you're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 full-blown different alternatives that you're handing to City Council. I think you're going to have sort of one core, proposal, and there's going to be some variations off of that on one facility or another, or how to finance or not finance, or how fast to do it, or that sort of thing. But I think there's going to be kind of a core there that you're going to work from, and there will be some other, but you could also do this.
It seems to me that's going to fall in, if the numbers guys are going to look at this picture and start with the numbers and figure out how we're going to pay for it, and then we can envision what it's going to be so we can pay for it, and the arts guys are going to start with, this is the vision, we'll figure out how to pay for it as we work our way back down. There are going to be alternatives based upon the financing structure that we may end up coming down. We have this great vision, and then it's trade-offs to figure out how to pay for it. Well, you can do that, but then you're going to have to sell this, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to lease this. And a lot of that information won't be available to us until, for instance, if somebody said, wouldn't the Bank of the West building over there make a great city hall? We don't know if it's for sale. We don't know if they would sell it. Same with the hotel in the CDF building. Same with the Lyman Park little Shake Shack idea. Maybe it's possible, maybe it's not, and maybe we won't have that information to make a final decision. So we may need some various alternatives in case it doesn't pan.
So let me ask you, you can either make a decision about one of these particular approaches right now, or we could start this other exercise where we're actually capturing things that you think are important, starting to list some of those values, and then you can come back to that, deciding what the approach is. And I would encourage you to decide on either the structured or the unstructured this evening, because if you're going to do presentations for each other, you need time to do that. So what's your pleasure? To hold off that till we do this exercise a little bit and get some of these things out, or do you want to make that decision now?
I think we should make the decision tonight and move forward. Otherwise, we have to take 4 weeks off, and we'll all figure out what we think is the best alternative. So I would like us to make a decision. I don't know if we need to do a motion or anything like that, or is it just sort of a raising of hands or general consensus. I'll throw out there that I think we ought to do the structured approach. So I don't know if there's anybody that has any violent disagreement with that, or if that's where we go.
That's where I stand also.
That's where I stand.
Me too.
I'd like to see a hybrid approach.
Structured.
I'll say structured.
I'm leaning towards the hybrid concept, that if it's structured, that because we're all friends and we all can talk and it's not as structured as the name would imply, and you can just tell us what you think and you can say whatever you want and nobody's going to laugh at you if you come up with a creative idea. Who cares? That'd be great. I'd love to be stimulated. So I don't know that the structured approach is going to be problematic with this group. And it would be great if the Brown Act wasn't the Brown Act and we could all go have some beer and talk about our different ideas and little groups and bring them back and meet with you. But we can't do that. So we're going to have to do it all together right here, it seems like, and that would be the structured approach.
I favored structured, and I presume there will not be a 3-minute rule.
Sounds like we'll roll with the structured approach and play it loose, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Who came up with the word structured?
Yeah, it seems wrong, doesn't it? It seems like the wrong definition of what you're talking about.
I feel boxed in by it, but anyway. I kind of agree with Doug. little bit looser there. The word structure just kind of, I went to Berkeley in the 60s. It kind of bothers me a little bit, so.
We can call it the loosely structured.
All right, so can we begin with what is important to you? And Mark and Cindy are going to use these flip charts to capture what you're saying, so watch them writing it down. They'll go every other one so that we don't impede your brainstorming process. This is not about, we really want to brainstorm, so it's not about teasing it out or, correcting somebody, but really what is important? What do you want to capture about the city of St. Helena?
I want beautiful, well-designed, practical spaces that we're proud of for our city buildings.
Are you going to write all that down?
Mark's got that one. Cindy's
Mark's
ready
got
for the
that
next one.
Our general plan talks about over and over and over that we maintain the small town, rural community feeling of this place, and we ought to be keeping that in mind as we work our way through the kinds of facilities that we want on Adam Street, but also in the way we redesign the city hall and wherever we put it, and however we do that, and keeping also in mind that the people who live in this little town are our neighbors. So as we decide where we want to put and move and place things, we have to remember what the impacts are on those neighbors, because it is a small rural community.
So small rural community impacts on neighbors. Okay.
I'd like to see spaces for city employees that are safe, and give them an incentive to work here.
I would say that's my main wish, is to make sure our city employees have a safe place to work, and it's most importantly first thing on my mind.
I would agree with those two, that I think a baseline that will be a given is that the criteria must address each department's needs, operations needs assessment for each department. That's going to be a given. Sorry, Cindy, I wasn't very succinct.
How about efficient use of space?
I think it's important to recognize the community and the diversity of our community, and I think we need spaces and places where that diverse community can come together. So I don't know if that's, community halls, I don't know if it's plazas and amphitheaters and outdoor stages, but we need gathering places, I think, for this community that everybody feels comfortable in.
I'd like to see a balance of interests so that not only do we recognize community-specific interests, but also the business interests of the community and whatever other interest groups there are.
To jump in again, it seems that I fully agree with you that we need places where people can gather. We also need to have reasons for people to gather, so we need facilities that will allow us to look for opportunities for more cultural and artistic and all kinds of reasons for people to gather here that will help the tourists come to town as well as the community, so that everybody's gaining something from these places. So we need some facilities that allow us to make that possible.
I totally agree with that. And then I can't go very long without mentioning my favorite topic, and that is we need to use some of the space we have in town to build housing for people who work here.
I was going to echo something Mark said. In addition to basic city operations, department functions, I think we have an opportunity to address some community cultural values, community gathering spaces, or something that has a cultural component that is consistent with the town's vision of itself, if you will, if we can say that. One component of that, I think, is that we need to address or accept the fact that we're in a tourism area, but I use the term sustainable tourism is something that I think is a criteria that we have to come to grips with, and perhaps that could be reflected in some kind of cultural component of one of the facilities.
I think a good stewardship with a long-term vision and a plan in place to maintain whatever it is we decide to build.
I think self-sustaining, if possible, and full utilization of facilities is paramount. If we have half-used buildings, we're idiots.
I think we have to make sure we don't sell our soul, though. We've had some pretty wild things suggested in years past, to supposedly fund whatever all the facility needs were, and it really felt like we were selling out to the promises that had been made to the community when we, for instance, bought Adams Street. Adams Street was supposed to be for the community. It wasn't supposed to be a future development opportunity that was going to raise $25 million for the city. That's not what that was bought for. So.
Well, I have a giant list because I've been thinking about this for 6 months, but I'm not going to go through my giant list. Oliver, I always structure everything, so that's I talk about it in structure. So I group things. I start out with the kind of high level objectives, and people have talked about these. I have a whole category here that I call character of the city related, and it has included in it community meeting spaces, housing, traffic, parking, open space, water, environmental impacts, aesthetics, all sort of related to the character of the town and maintaining that. Of course, facilities related criteria to make sure that our facilities are being used effectively and that they're high quality and that we're able to maintain them and so on. Can kind of flip that around. You can look at the same thing from a services standpoint, that our facilities are there to provide services, so you can sort of recouch this in terms of all of the services that the city is supposed to be able to provide to us, and can they do that effectively for us. Another category that's finance related, making sure that we have operational stability for the city and the general fund to make sure that we're able to generate the capital or funding for the capital needs that we're talking about here. That includes the facilities. It includes infrastructure. I don't think that's been mentioned yet. One of the other goals is to upgrade and maintain our infrastructure much better than we've been doing for the last 25 years. The opportunities for the balanced tourist visitation thing, minimize the time to achieve all this if possible, manage the funding of it so that we're doing it in a smart way, and I'll stop there.
What about water?
Yeah, I thought I said that in my first character thing. And people could probably add more to that. I think one of the interesting challenges is this statement in the mission about preserving our small-town rural character. Well, people talk about that all the time, but what do they really mean by that? It's sort of a hard thing to define. We all kind of know it when we see it, but if you ask somebody, tell me what it is, it's devilishly hard to define exactly what it is.
I think
but we all care about it a lot.
Tell us what it isn't is easier.
Yeah.
I take a class on Monday night from a man called John Wilson that some of you may know. He's a wonderful guy, economist, been a professor at Berkeley, and he's from a small town in Missouri. And he went back there recently to a reunion of his high school or his college. And he said when he left, there were all these cute little shops all up and down the street, And he came back and the town was like empty. There was nothing there. And it was called Walmart. And it totally destroyed this small city. So I think that's a value that we have here. I think we have to be reasonable about it, because I think we could probably have some formula stores in downtown St. Helena that would still maintain the small town feeling, but would bring more business to town. But certainly we have to maintain the value of not having large formula stores like Walmart. Although I go to Target in Napa.
That's Napa, though.
Yeah, just maybe a last one would be future thinking in terms of what our population is. We haven't gained population in years, and it doesn't look like we're going to gain more. We're getting to have more and more weekend homes here. Population has declined. So as we're looking at these facilities and how we're going to use them, it seems to me to be unlikely that we're going to need more space for a city hall than we already have, it's just because of our population changes and growth. So we should be forward thinking in terms of what we're doing with all of these, long-term thinking in terms of what we're doing with all of these.
Is there anything else you want to preserve or protect? Values, attributes of St. Helena.
Yeah, open space. We need more, if anything. We need to get people out of their cars and provide a better transportation network for pedestrians and bicyclers. And a little bit to Doug's point, we are getting more weekenders, but at the same time, I think Pat mentioned it. We need workforce housing. So I think Mark's mentioned it several times. He doesn't think that staff is going to grow exponentially or anything, but I would hope that we wouldn't be afraid of new people moving in, and providing space for our workers. So because the middle income folks don't live here, really.
I think we also need to wonder about our families that live here and see what's happening in the schools with enrollment. I know that a lot of enrollment's gone down, so if we don't have housing for families to move in, where are the children going to come to fill our schools?
I also wanted to say I would like to keep it, St. Helena, a place that you want to raise your family. And you come here and you say, this is a great place to raise my family. And there are all these facilities. They can do all these things. You don't have to just go to Meadowood. There's also something through the city that's affordable and wonderful and great.
Also, I'd like to see us be maybe advocates or help out the Historical Society. I think that to have a group of people who are volunteers to take care of all the historical assets that are part of our community that we all cherish and want to continue to keep the character of is a very large task to be borne by a small group. And I think that the city should look at that and say, hey, that's our history. We need to take care of that. And whatever we can do to lend greater support to that, whether that's putting those guys in the historical people in the Carnegie Building or the Signorelli Barn or something like that, but help create a home for them so that when we want to talk about our history, when we want to look back at when the buildings were built or William H. Cortlandt designed the Star Building or whatever, that we can point to that and see what it is. And if my fear is that if we don't give some type of extra credence right now to that, we might miss the boat. So if we're talking about all these things, I think that should be considered also.
Thank you for that, Jeff. As president of the Historical Society, I have to contain myself up here, so thank you for mentioning us.
I'm going to jump in on that one just a little bit. I do cherish the Historical Society, and I think that definitely needs a place somewhere. I don't know that it's the city's place to do that. I mean, we have other groups. I mean, Miranda House. I mean, town did not give them a place to, and they raised funds for that. I think we could certainly work with individual interest groups, whether it's Robert Louis Stevenson, whether it's a historical society, whatever it is. I mean, what we,
Well, we just want to capture ideas and not.
I know,
Okay.
So we were talking about ideas of leaving a place for the historical society. So I was addressing the fact that I think we got to be careful about calling out then specific groups for specific things that aren't city services.
Let me try a way of dealing with that and talk about partnerships. Partnerships with our business community, partnerships with organizations like the Wine Train or CIA or the college or the health center. These various things to make sure we have integrated them into our planning.
Excuse me for interjecting again here, talking too much, I guess. I just looked at the vision statement. I had not seen that for the first, until now. It's my first time looking at the vision statement for the city of St. Helena. And some of the things we're talking about, you could almost lift out of the second half of the vision statement in terms of, value-driven criteria, to Tim's point, that also folds in, values that are important to the community. But the last 3 lines of that vision statement, if you pulled out those words, they would almost match some of the things that we're talking about as value-driven criteria for some approach.
Can you read those to us so we can capture that?
Infrastructure, water security, and housing, those are important but maybe not as glamorous, if you will. The others talk about cultural and recreational opportunities, embraces the historic character. So historic, small town character, beautiful natural environment, high quality of life, and then I would add Ann's point, or some of the other points, family friendly. If that's could be added to that, and maybe there are some others, but as I was listening and glancing at the vision, it occurred to me that some of those value-driven criteria jump out of the vision statement.
Observation.
We ready to move to things that you want to avoid? So negative attributes, unintended negative consequences. What are things that you want to make sure you're not a part of growing in St. Helena?
Traffic.
Negatively impacting longtime neighbors, whatever we're going to do. Don't want to do that.
Having moved here from the Los Angeles basin, I would like to see us avoid dirty air. And I've lived here 18 years now, and I am beginning to see a subtle change in the air when I drive from here to Napa. So I'd really like to see us avoid contamination of the air.
Money can't be the driver. I think that maybe we get a little too wrapped up, or some people have gotten too wrapped up in the idea that we have to have millions and millions of dollars and we have to have it now, and nothing else matters. So money shouldn't be a driver here. It shouldn't be the driver.
I think to kind of help shape some of this moving forward, to give the city council and the city staff the ability to be more flexible in how they create solutions moving forward and not maybe being stuck, for example, by our antiquated zoning, which for the central business district is not appropriate for the time and place we live in. Consequently, that zoning will likely be rewritten and redrafted. And to your point about Walmart, today it's Amazon. And that's changing the faces of every town, everywhere. And we need to, if we want to embrace with the business community and to draw people here, to get that balance between tourism and localism and draw those dollars here, not as a primary reason, but simply because it takes dollars to make things go, to give them the ability to be more nimble in that. And I'm not sure what that looks like, but that's on the policy side, which needs to match what we're trying to do moving forward.
I just noticed something I left out from the vision list that talks to that a little bit. Local business is one of the vision criteria. Local business.
We're still focused on things to avoid here. Did anybody mention water impacts? I think that's something we want to be a little bit careful that we don't get ourselves into a risky situation. Who knows what the climate's going to do in the future, and we've got to be a little cognizant of not kind of towing too fine a line here with what water we have and how much that we're committed to using. I would throw in safety. We don't want the town to become less safe. One of the really special things about St. Helena is it's an incredibly safe place to live, and there's a reason for that. Our police department does an incredible job. We all sort of contribute to keeping this a safe place, and that would be a major negative if this somehow became a less safe place to live. I would throw in one more. I'd like to minimize the risk for our city getting into financial trouble. I like the idea of us having a good, solid general reserve, and I don't think we want to also put that at any risk. Who knows what the future holds in terms of recessions and whatnot, and I don't want the city to get into financial straits again where we can't afford to maintain infrastructure and things like that.
Just a footnote to the traffic to avoid, or an add-on to that, is lack of parking as something to avoid.
I want to avoid taking away services without finding an alternative for people that use them.
I'd like to see us avoid a city in which there's no ethnic and economic diversity. I think there's another way to say that, and maybe somebody else is a wordsmith. But I would really like to see us avoid being that kind of city.
Anything else on the avoid? So what are some of the pressing needs that you see that you want to meet in whatever plan you come up with? Pressing needs.
Well, for me, however we decide where these buildings go or what is done, I think we have a problem with our traffic circulation in a lot of areas, and I don't know how that's ever going to be solved. But it's a major problem that we have to deal with.
Well, I'll throw out the obvious one. City Hall would be super high priority.
I think places for community gathering and, in the types of venues that would, encourage people that are locally to come out and see things, but also to drag tourists here. We do have a number of hotels here. We may get another one, and we'd rather them stay right here. But we need to have certain activities for them to stick around and be attracted to.
And in that same vein, so that it's not just we come here to drink wine in 3 wineries during a day, that's it. We want to offer something that's culturally an incentive for them to come here and stay, a week-long program, a month-long program, but more importantly, teaching programs, so that if it's a Philharmonic program and they're going to be here, it should be master classes that every little kid in St. Helena gets to go to for free, so that you can see a professional ballerina being taught by or directed by a professional director, so they can be inspired. So these things should inspire tourists and inspire local kids and local people. So we're bringing in tourists, getting them to stay longer, and giving our city something. It's all going to generate funds and pay for itself eventually if we do this. It's done in other places. We're not inventing the wheel. It's done in other places. We should be able to do it very easily.
I think we have a pressing need to have a robust, thriving business community, especially on Main Street.
I think the Public Works facility that we toured, I'm not sure what the solution is, but in terms of pressing, that was, to me, the most urgent one, whatever needs to be done there.
Mark Prestwich might not want to hear this, but the roads are a pressing priority in this town, and I'm not. It's people that come here to visit also mention the shape of our roads, so the roads are a big deal.
I think we're going to have to, definitely come up with something that raises money and provides some significant sustaining income.
Sorry, I think about this all the time, but the sidewalks downtown, they need to be fixed.
We've touched on this before, but for the list of priorities, I think that we need to make sure that we have a combination of functionality with aesthetics in the solutions. If you take a look at downtown Napa, for example, the flood project was a terrific blend of enterprise and vision that produced a result that really enhanced it. It solved the functional need, but it also produced a beautiful product.
Well, and if I can just add this isn't necessarily priorities, but it wasn't anything that produced, and this is sort of to Glenn's point, it wasn't something that produced a specific revenue generating, asset. But what it did do is it attracted people to come to Napa, which then spent money. So I guess a priority for me, if I can get there, would be that we shouldn't make it a priority that whatever the city does with the city properties and things that we maybe want to build, that we don't also then have to have a component of a development that then pays for that thing we want to build. So, for instance, if we want to build a community center on, Adams Street, that shouldn't be contingent upon, we have to build a hotel there or some retail space there that, we can sell to somebody to build the community center. I think if we build it, they will come. If we,
That's right. And building a hotel doesn't mean people are going to come. You have to give them a reason to come and stay in that hotel. Then allow the hotels to come in. So TOT isn't the panacea; it's the after effect panacea. If we get these things, and I think Glenn talking about public-private partnerships and nonprofits is a great way to go. The building doesn't have to be paid for by selling an additional hotel. If you can get Google to buy the naming rights and put this up and be a partner in that, then problem half solved. And if the city gives the land or leases the land, gives nothing but leases. But I think there are a lot of ways to skin these cats, and that's what we should be looking at on the back end once we've decided what we want.
Art, I don't see, you drive through Yountville, you see these incredible installations, whether it's the tomato basket or the fish or the tree that lights up or the little rocks that are mushrooms or these things that are in a very small town. As you're, kind of to Mark's point, while you're there, you kind of engage that, and then they come because there's more of a reason, and it's the added layers.
Right.
So they don't come to see the mushroom rocks in front of the post office, but while I'm going to get a nice dinner, oh, by the way, that's pretty cool too.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of things, and that's where I think St. Helena has the biggest opportunity because we're a blank canvas right now in a lot of those areas. So, and they're integrated, right? It's not like, oh, you build a city hall and that's it. No, it's creating a better sense of community for kids, spaces, everything else. And, we have a great opportunity in front of us, and I think I'd love for, in 50 years, for people to look at this town and go, wow, they were thinking, right? So, and hopefully they're maybe even not, anyway, sorry.
No, it's good.
Jeff, when you mentioned Yountville, you reminded me of two reasons I like to go to events in Yountville. I can park my car and I can go to the bathroom. And if we have two pressing needs in this town, it's parking and public restrooms.
And EV stations for cars. There's going to be more and more of them, and they attract people because people look on their map, they see where they can go, and they park there. At least I do.
One of the things that St. Helena has as a problem, and somehow we have to convert it into an opportunity, is that we have a highway that runs right through the middle of town. And Yountville doesn't, which allows them to do a lot of things, and Calistoga doesn't. And somehow we have to deal with that, and some parts of St. Helena's Main Street are beautiful. And some parts, frankly, are just block buildings. And I really think that it would be enormously helpful if we tried to improve the beauty of those buildings and make more out of Main Street. It's got to become an opportunity instead of, just this big problem of trucks and cars running up and down that street. Anyway, that's the thought.
One idea I've thought of that maybe is too much in the grass talks about traffic and clean air and EV stations and Main Street. The idea of, and it might anchor to the Civic Center, if you will, and other key points around town that might help Main Street as well. That's the idea of some kind of electric jitney that would have a circulation route that would enable people to just jump on and jump off. Maybe the Chamber of Commerce could operate it. There could even be a couple of town docents that are on the sidewalk or on a jitney that enables it facilitates people getting around very easily. That's pretty far off of the facilities topic, but I just thought I'd throw that out based on what Glenn said.
I'm noticing the time, and I'm wondering, the idea is that we would bring these same questions back next time to see if there's anything you add. We'll type them up and get them out to you. And then we'll have another set of questions to whittle some of these down a little bit more. And I think I heard your point to get those out ahead of time. Yeah. We have folks that need time to process and think through. It's tough to do right now. So we will do that, but for now we're moving with this more structured, this loosely structured approach. We're starting to build at least the values and some of the framework about where you all are coming from. We're going to continue to do that, and then we'll move into some of the next steps about actual alternatives. I'm going to invite you at every meeting to list other information that you need or want, and I picked up a bunch of it, so there will be those 3 items coming to you on the 28th, the financial forecast, the EMG updates, and what restrictions there are on any of the properties.
Or utilization of the properties.
and you want utilization of the properties. Okay.
We talked about for the community groups to have a larger map with the different buildings and talking a little bit about the kind of the profile of each building.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'd be a great tool for us to have also. And I think what also might be helpful is if we could have up on the screen maybe that long-range financial forecast for 10 years or whatever, where it showed the general fund and it showed the amount of revenue and things like that. If that's, I think you could just throw the slide up or whatever that is, but just a couple tools like that would help us, moving forward to better analyze things.
Mark, how far out is the long-range financial forecast going to go?
At the moment, we're looking at 10 years. However, I'm going to invite a few people to help me take a look at that over the next week and explore whether we should go out a little bit farther. It's just simply a matter of making a few assumptions. But we are going to model different scenarios, a hotel, a recession, what happens if the fire department has a trouble finding firefighters. So we're going to take an opportunity to look at the future through a few different lenses to give you a little more feedback and data for you to consider.
Will that include a positive future as well if the economy doesn't have a recession and we do well, so that we have a sense of where it could go? I mean, that's basically what happened in the last one, that we didn't include a positive. We went to a medium improvement and a terrible improvement, but we never had a positive improvement. That's what we ended up with. So it would be useful to have that.
The positive is going to be slightly conservative because we don't want to be unrealistic, but at the same time, we are going to be the positive in the future is based on the historical trends. So we've broken down sales tax, property tax, hotel tax, and tried to establish trends over time. And we've excluded, for purposes of that, the recession years, because we are going to model a recession in the future. I think we're looking out 2 years at this point, but those assumptions are all going to be noted for you, and you'll see the historical data, the actuals, and the growth over time.
Great.
We gave you the mission and the vision, and we gave you the goals that the City Council is using. And we gave those to you as data points, simply so that you get a better sense of the audience you're going to be bringing your recommendations to. So what's already in the pipeline, what's the focus, what are the top priorities that the council has set. Next week, we do the 2 open to the public engagements. We encourage you to invite people to come to them. You are more than welcome to come yourselves. You just can't say anything. But it's great to get the pulse of the public, and so we'll be talking about some of the questions we did today, but also doing something similar to what we did with you and having groups come and visit and talk about the different particular properties. So that kind of speed dating process that we did, we'll do a hybrid of those two with the group. And we'll do the same process with both the afternoon session and the evening session. Then there will be forums. So we also put a sheet on there capturing the demographics and the particular groups on those forums. The focus groups, I'm sorry. Is there anything missing? Did we miss anything that you said, or have you had a thought since then of a group or a particular demographic in the city that should be represented?
I wanted to go back to the workshops. Have you guys determined a methodology or a way that you're going to capture demographics?
Definitively determine that, no, but we will be.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Did you add Woodbridge to the seniors demographic? It's a pretty good group in there, pretty good sized group.
I just had a thought on the demographic thing. There was a town hall meeting. I think it was back around the 2010, where they handed out the little audience response clickers, and we all had these little clickers, and there was probably 150 people there. It was a big one, And they put questions up there, and we all voted, and the clickers only let you vote once. You can't press the button like 100 times and have it add up. So there are, you don't have to go rent those little things. There are really good applications now on smartphones that do exactly the same thing. For anybody that has a smartphone, you give them a little code. It's pretty easy to do. You just bring it up, and you could easily collect demographic data because it's all anonymous. So it's just an idea for getting more than just identifying whether, I mean, you can look at us and tell if we're old or young and male or female, but beyond those basic visual demographics, you could get some more information that way.
And we have discussed the use of that type of approach for the focus groups in particular. Just one note in terms of the updated, this is an updated document, this list of focus groups. What we've done is we've combined the businesses and the chamber. These were ideas that you generated, so this list was created by you. And we've added, and this is a bit of a nod to Stan, I believe, city staff to the list, because we anticipate that the city staff themselves can help inform some of the thinking that may be helpful, and I think there was a reference to a department needs assessment. So in that spirit, this is one of the reasons why this is added to the list tonight.
One I would see here is maybe embedded here, maybe isn't, but the Hispanic community.
We mentioned that.
Whether that goes, you go specifically to, Hunts Grove and the other one, or combine the two or something, but that would certainly be one place to, I mean, there's a number of Hispanics that don't live there either, but I think you got to get the Hispanic group, the community in here somehow. Because and I think that's it can be a struggle. I mean, some of my past experiences to try and get them to come out and be willing to share their thoughts. But there are some community leaders that probably should help you be able to do that.
We really want you, I know some of you already have sent names. Cindy's now the point person for that, so if you have the names of people that would fit in these groups, if you could tell us what group you're thinking of and actually give us names, we will be inviting folks into the focus groups. And there's more to that, I think.
It would be helpful for us to have a couple of volunteers, maybe 3 different committee members, help us identify people that could fit into this group. So we'll receive names from all of you, but it would also be helpful for people that may know a lot of people in town, recognize some names, and help us work on populating different demographics here that you've identified. Are there some volunteers that I could write down tonight?
I already sent you.
I think you need a diverse group for that, too, so you're going to get 3.
At least 3.
Microphone.
I would try and get a diverse group on that also, and so if you're going to pick 3, I would try and work that, and I think Anna should definitely be one of them, because she's close to the school-age kids and families, so...
I already gave you a list of a suggestion of seniors. I could provide you the names of a few people in the Hispanic community.
Are there other volunteers that can sit down with staff and help us put people into different, and make sure that we have all of these various demographics represented in focus groups that would be willing to help us?
I'll help with that.
Right, I have,
Oh, you
I
had
have
me.
Suzanne and Anna. And I don't know, Pat, if you were volunteering or if there were others.
Well, I think
You have names.
I jumped the gun on it, but I'm volunteering to give you about 3 or 4 names of people I know in the Hispanic community.
Okay. You may work with a chair as well then in helping to, if we have any gaps to fill, you'll hear from us. Okay.
Do we have some timing on these focus group meetings?
We're looking at the first, we'll be doing 2 sets, and we're looking at the first one in maybe the 2nd or 3rd week of March. The second set would be when you're at the place of beginning to at least formulate some of your alternatives so that they can weigh in on those alternatives. And we really want, and I know this is counterintuitive a lot of times, but giving us names of people who see things really differently, but might be in the same demographic, is exactly what we want. We really want diverse perspectives. So please be thinking along the lines of, oh my gosh, these guys see things really differently, or these women do. So. Was there anything else? I think we're done with this piece.
I don't know if there's any member of the public out there that wants to say anything at the end of the meeting. Have any thoughts?
I've got an extra copy if you want.
All right, meeting adjourned.
All right.